Hello, welcome or welcome back to the Cozy Chaos that is my channel. I'm Kat and I did something silly just out of curiosity and also because I wanted to make this video because I thought it would be fun. I took to Reddit and decided to post what are your hot takes as a fantasy nerd. Last night, I provided some examples of my own in the post and then I went to sleep. And I woke up this morning to 151,000 views and 589 comments. I'm just gonna go through these. We are gonna have a fun time. We are withholding judgment. We are just in it for the teehees and the camaraderie of the fantasy nerd community. All right? No judgments here, just teehees. Okay, so let's start off with the hot takes that I decided to post as examples. The Hobbit movies were worth it for Martin Freeman, Benedict Cumberbatch, more Gollum, more Gandalf, individual personalities for the dwarves, and even more reasons I can't remember right now. And I will die on that hill, okay? I feel like those movies got so much crap when they came out, and I will be the first one to admit that they're not like, masterpieces. The original trilogy, that's a masterpiece. However, to say that they are objectively bad and never should have been made? Okay, but then we never would have gotten to see Martin Freeman's take on Bilbo Baggins. Just for a moment, try to imagine a world in which we never got that. Are you imagining it? Is it dark? That's correct. I've read The Hobbit. I haven't read the original trilogy. I will get around to that, I promise. I know it's a crime, and I do not want to go to fantasy jail. But having read The Hobbit, one of my biggest gripes with it, which, is an amazing book and I adored it, but the dwarves all just kind of seem like one unit. They have a singular personality and there's no distinction between them as people. So I thought it was just so fun to actually get these individual characters through these amazing actors that they hired. It was a stacked cast, okay? Okay. I mean, I didn't even mention Lee Pace as Thranduil. Come on. Oh, I just shook the camera. Sorry. But you get my point. There were not the best movies ever made. Am I glad they were made? Yes. Very much so. Thank you very much. I also said that sci-fi slash cyberpunk, anything that has to do with like a machinery fantasy, machine fantasy, should have its own section separate from traditional fantasy in bookstores and libraries. And I got some pushback on this in the comments. And it's just a personal thing that, like, I actually don't think that most people would agree with this. I think most people probably also don't feel as strongly about the differences between high fantasy and fantasy that involves technology. But I see a huge difference, and I don't know. I would just prefer to see them in different sections because they seem so different to me. But that's just a me thing. That's just a me thing. Remember, we're not judging. We're just here for the teehees. Also, century-long age gaps in romantic relationships are fine if the author isn't solely glorifying it and acknowledges the power dynamic. Okay? And then I said the Darkling in Shadow and Bone illustrates this preference perfectly. Leonie from the book Leo, she makes an excellent point. I think the phrase that is becoming popularized is shadow daddy, where they are at least 100 years older than the female main character, which I understand why that's hot. Do not get me wrong. The Darkling does it for most people, okay? And I get it, okay? I'm not saying it's not hot. I would like it to be a consideration that this man would have nothing in common with an 18-year-old girl. If you think about it, a 70-year-old man and an 18-year-old girl is creepy, right? Like, okay, you just need to go and watch Book Leo's video about this because she explains it so much better than I will ever do. But yeah, that's another thing that I feel like is a bit of a hot take, especially in the romantasy community, which I'm not really a part of, so I can't really speak to that, but you catch my drift. And then the last thing that I said was cannon fodder races, orcs, Trollocs, Urgles, stormtroopers, etc., should be left in the past. Stay with me, stay with me. Hear me out. Objectively evil and irredeemable races are not nearly as interesting as complex antagonists who have reasons for their wrongdoings beyond the story needed brainless, scary manifestations of the evil in the world. And I also saw some pushback to this point in the comments, and I think it kind of purely comes down to preference with this as well, especially this one. I just think it's a cop-out. I mentioned this in my Aragon reread video, that these races that you are supposed to, you don't feel any guilt when they die. I hesitate to use the word dehumanizing because they're not humans, but you know what I mean. I just feel like it's not as interesting to have a race of people that are completely expendable because they're objectively evil. I get why it's fun, because it's a scary concept. It's a very terrifying thing to imagine, but I also think that maybe I just don't want to be that scared. Maybe that's really at the heart of all of this, is I'm like, well, if you humanize the monsters a little bit, maybe I'll be a little bit less scared and I'll enjoy myself more. That's probably really what it is. But those are the things that I said are my hot takes as a fantasy nerd. And then I said, what are yours? And I got 518 responses. So let's go through these. The first few are definitely responses to mine. People made a lot of similar arguments. I'll push back on one of yours. I think unapologetic evil has a valid place in fantasy and is sometimes more fun to read than evil that has a good reason for being evil. And then somebody seconded that. And they actually made a really interesting point. Having a society comprised of entirely evil people helps explore what evil actually is, which I think is a very complex concept, because what is evil? We're getting a little philosophical here, but in my opinion, no person can be truly evil. And I'm literally making this video on the day of the 2025 US inauguration. So please bear in mind that I recognize evil deeds and evil actions, but to categorize or label a person as objectively evil is to absolve them of the responsibility and consequences of enacting that evil, because they're irredeemable. Humans are infinite, and we are all capable of doing terrible things to ourselves and to each other and to the world. And I think it's a bit of a cop-out, because you are completely separating them from the choices that they have made, from the experiences that they have had in order to get to where they are. I don't know. That's just my opinion. Maybe I'm coming at this a little too seriously. I'm taking it a little too seriously for fantasy. But one of the reasons I enjoy fantasy so much is because it is a reflection of the real world. It's a way to explore really large, complex issues that are relevant to the world we currently live in a fantastical way, you know? So I see that argument. I see it. I don't judge it. I disagree. And then there are a lot more replies. People saying the orcs are an extension of an idea, not a literalist argument for inborn genetic evil. I disagree. I do believe that the extension of the idea is that they are a literal manifestation of inborn genetic evil, which I don't believe exists. And, you know, lots of things exist in fantasy that don't exist in the real world. It's just my preference. Okay, I'm gonna move on from people's responses to my stuff, because there's a whole thread. I'm going to link this thread in the comments so you can read them for yourself, or if you want to contribute to it, you can. Okay, so finally, moving on to other people's hot takes. We've got, I am sick of flashbacks. They are way overdoing it with some of these shows. And then somebody said, sometimes flashbacks are a necessary narrative device. See Project Hail Mary, for example. It's a better book, in my opinion, because it's not told in a linear fashion. And then somebody mentioned Lost. Somebody said they blame Lost for much of this, which is totally fair. Somebody else said nowadays it's just useless exposition. Somebody else said that it can be fundamental lore. Yeah, I feel like it's too general of a criticism. That is a really big generalization, that all flashbacks are done poorly. I mean, I am finishing up season 2 of Arcane, and The nonlinear storytelling is incredible. I think that flashbacks, like somebody said, can be a very effective tool. Somebody said the flashback can be a dream. That's so much worse. I hope I never have to read another dream. I don't know. I think it can be very useful when you need to drop a piece of information about a character's past or the world's past or lore of the world in a way that still immerses you in the narrative and the storytelling. I don't know. I think that they can be done really well. And it seems like people are pretty divided on this. Somebody said, just write a damn character who has lived a life before the story and trust the readers to infer it from their internality. Is internality a word? Internality. Oh, it is a word. A person's inner nature, the long-term effects of a decision, and a person's introverted nature. But here's the thing. How are you supposed to make those inferences if you're not given any of the information? Specifically in books, flashbacks can be such a useful tool in showing versus telling. You know, a character can say, I was locked up for 9 years. It's like, yeah, I can infer that that was a rough time. I can't infer what literally happened to that person. I can't infer the minute details of an interaction that they had with somebody that they see years later after they've both gotten out of prison. You know, like, that's what I have to say about that. Next, we've got, I understand wanting unique characters, but when your character names are so convoluted, I'm always pondering whether or not I'm reading / saying them correctly. It takes me out of the story. Some people may need a slew of unique names. I do not. Yeah, I get that. I totally get that. That's part of the reason why I do immersive reading, which is where I'm reading the physical book and I am listening to the audiobook at the same time. So I don't have to make any guesses about how things are pronounced. My brain doesn't have to take a break to, you know, figure out how it's pronounced every time I read the name. That's my fix for that one. A lot of people agreed with this. Okay, yeah. So people seem to really want a balance between, on one end of the spectrum, you've got a completely unpronounceable, made up fantasy name that is unique and nobody else in our world or any world is going to have that name. And then, you know, Frank, which is super boring and doesn't stand out and isn't unique. A balance in between there is what people seem to really be yearning for. Distinguishable, yet not going to take them out of the story every time they have to read it. And like names that are pretty common, but they spell it with a Z instead of an S or a Y instead of an I. Those are always super funny. So somebody listed all of these S names. Samael, Shiriam, Siwan, Suroth, Semiraj, Samel, Seleucia, Sameshta, Cerilia, Thulin, Samitsu, Selita, Sayanid, Sarine, Sarin, Sayin, Celine, Shael, Sarancha, Sylvania, Saban, Satal, Sashal. And then said, these are all from the same series. I don't know what series that is, but that sounds dizzyingly confusing. In those cases, I'm kind of hoping to get a small 2D image of every character next to every mention of their name so that I can keep track of who is who. Yeah, that would be nice. That would be nice. Oh, somebody said which series? Wheel of Time. Those do sound like Wheel of Time names. Oh, and then somebody brought up aliases. Yeah, that always gets me too. I've seen cases where the various names have been used in the same paragraph. General Barry McPherson entered the room. Hey, Mac, said the figure in the corner. McPherson looked that way. The general's eyesight wasn't very good, so everything was just a blur. Who is that? Asked Barry. That was a cute example. I will say I feel like some people really enjoy the challenge of having to remember all of those names. It's a bit of a fun puzzle for some people, I think. I personally don't think I mind it. Definitely not as much as some of these folks. Okay, moving on. I think modern book marketing's focus on genre labels is making fantasy that feels truly otherworldly and unique harder to come by. Like, it feels like the majority of fantasy books on the market these days are like, here's an enemies to lovers story with closed door romance and an intricate magic system and a redeemed villain arc. I'd rather read a book that takes me to another world than read a book that feels like it exists to tick off a bunch of marketable boxes. It's why Lord of the Rings is so dang great, because it feels like reading folklore from some ancient culture that you stumbled upon in a dusty old library. It feels like an actual work of imagination. Here's the thing. Marketing for books has always existed. It's just adapted to a little something we call book talk around here. It's just this little thing. And it's not a bad thing. It's not objectively a bad thing, I don't think. I understand the frustration of a book being reduced to tropes and trends in order to market it. But I also think, as we have always done as readers, we can read the back of the book, do a little research of our own, and surmise whether or not we want to give that book a chance, regardless of how it was marketed. You know, if the marketing bothers you, ignore it. People are just so mad at book talk. And it's weird to say book talk now, considering it was banned yesterday. Although it also was unbanned yesterday, so I don't know. Yeah, I think that sums up my opinion on that, is that if the marketing in a Barnes and Noble bothers you, if the book tack table in the Barnes and Noble bothers you because it's tropey and it's, you know, saying that this one book is enemies to lovers and this other book is dark academia and this other book, do you like the cover? Go over and pick it up. Read the back. See if it interests you. Use your brain. Use your brain. You can do it. And then we've just got comments talking about books that are great. And I'm like, how did that have anything to do with marketing? Like, somebody said, that is why Piranesi is incredible to me. It takes fantasy and does entirely its own thing. Amazing book. Totally agree. I love that book. However, I'm certain that the marketing for that book didn't encompass everything that was great about it, because it can't. It needs to be snappy. It needs to get people's attention. It's like how Daniel Green says previews and trailers are lies. It's just supposed to get you interested in the book. It's not anything deeper than that. Yep, and somebody said what I was kind of expecting to hear on this particular comment thread. I am so done with all the bookstores stocking mainly romantasy books in the fantasy section. Where I live, those sections are dominated by YA like romantic fantasy books. They put fantasy in quotation marks. And the last few years, it feels like every time I excitedly walk up to the bookcases, I'm disappointed. In every bookstore? I think maybe you just need to find a different bookstore. Romantasy is a huge thing right now. I can understand why a bookstore who needs to make money is going to jump on that. However, I do understand. I personally don't like romantasy in general. So I understand the frustration. I'm not going to, negate that, because that would really frustrate me as well. But unless that's literally the only bookstore anywhere in your area, I feel like you could just try somewhere else. Go somewhere else to find the books you want to read. Bookstores have to eat too, Okay, somebody replied to that comment I just read with, I always like to order books from a self-made list I vetted through reading reviews, so I was pretty surprised when I went with my girlfriend last week and most novels in the fantasy section were romantasy and YA. Also, something I noticed was that it's mostly female fantasy authors which are listed. Now what, let's unpack that, shall we? Why are you miffed that they're mostly female fantasy authors? I'm so sorry that there are more female fantasy authors that are, getting their flowers nowadays. No, I'm not sorry. I personally don't tend to like romantasy, which is largely written by women. I'm not gonna harbor any anger about them and their success, though. don't want to say misogyny, but I do want to say misogyny. I recommend convincing a few dozen million more men to pick up reading as a hobby. And then somebody replied to that, I don't know if that's the problem. Wasn't there an article recently claiming not enough men read only for it to be disproven later? Plus, fantasy is/was generally regarded as a very male type genre. If you look at the more classical or non-romantic type of fantasy, the gender balance is much more even/skewed. Even/skewed towards male authors. I don't understand the point that's being made by either of these people. If we look at the history of fantasy books, the people that have been highly regarded in the industry have been men. They were written by men for men, usually white men. Does it mean that women weren't reading fantasy or didn't want to read fantasy? No. Did it mean that women and non-men were not writing fantasy or wanting to write fantasy and be successful? No. So how is this in any way like an argument to be made against female fantasy authors being successful within the fantasy genre under the umbrella of romantasy? I'm going to move on from that one because I'm getting a little heated. It's hot in here all of a sudden. Ugh. Oh, wow. Okay, somebody said, media literacy is dead here. I see depiction being mistaken with glorification and characters' views being confused with authors' views at least weekly. Characters' views being confused with authors' views? If somebody is confusing a character's view with the author's view, that probably means that the author didn't do an effective enough job of making sure that they were not glorifying something that is objectively bad. If somebody writes a book that includes colonization, let's say, and doesn't put effort into making sure that colonization is not being presented in a positive light, then maybe your readers are going to consider that to be the author's point of view. Somebody has said it better than I could. While this is true, I also see a lot of people dismissing very good arguments that it isn't actually just a character viewpoint thing, usually in an attempt to avoid acknowledging problems in a book or series they love. Anytime Dresden comes up, I point to the Bombshells short story as an example of how the sexualization of women in the series isn't just a product of Dresden's POV. I have not read the Dresden Files, but I can totally see, I can totally understand what they mean by this. The second part of this, the same person's argument is sometimes disentangling narrative intent versus character voice is tricky, and other times much simpler. I think Name of the Wind is a good example. Personally, I don't think Kavoth is nearly as unreliable a narrator as people are claiming, and have a lot of issues with book 2 that mean I won't read the third if it comes out. But I can also admit that it isn't something I feel nearly as sure about as in other narratives versus character voice discussions. I would say if you are reading a book and you are unsure whether or not a negative character POV is connected to the author's POV, that may be on the author. Just saying! Somebody said, and I can only imagine it in this voice. Yeah, this sub is off its bloody rocker. Here is another hot take. Some of the fantasy bloat could be reduced if authors and publishers returned to standalone novels. Everything doesn't have to be a series. I don't disagree with that. I think that the art of the standalone novel is underrated. Telling a complete story within just 300 to 500 pages. It's not a bad thing, you know? Yeah, I wouldn't mind seeing some more standalone fantasy books. There are a lot that I think people should probably seek out. You know? Even within a world, like in Brandon Sanderson's world, in the Cosmere, the Brandon Sanderson universe. Again, I haven't read any of his books yet. I will be soon, though. Stay tuned for that. I know that, like, Tress of the Emerald Sea is within that universe, but it's a standalone story within that universe. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, which I think still counts. You don't have to have read the other books in the series or from the main series, even though it's an experience that seems like it would be enriched by having read those books. I think that there are a lot more standalones out there than people realize. Somebody said, I'm one of those people who absolutely prefers book series over standalone books, and the majority of the books I own are in a book series. Cool. Oh, and they have this emoji that's like, I don't think I have a preference. I tend to find that series have deeper and more fleshed out worlds than most standalones, and that aspect helps keep me more immersed. I actually, I do agree with that. I do appreciate, like in a trilogy form, the ability to get deeper into the character and world development, and the more lore you can give me, the happier I am. So sadly, they don't sell as well. Standalones, I guess this person means slouchy guy. That's a really cute username. Yeah, I feel like that might be true. I don't know the numbers on that though. Maybe they don't. I mean, it's difficult. I guess you really don't see fandoms really, like big fandoms for standalone books. Maybe for an author that writes, you know what? That's not true. Because now I'm thinking of like romance and literary fiction authors that write exclusively standalones, and they have huge followings. So maybe it's more of a fantasy thing specifically, that standalone fantasy doesn't tend to blow up and have huge followings as much as fantasy series. That's the rub. Okay. Somebody made a really good point on my sci-fi / cyberpunk should have its own section separate from traditional fantasy. They said there's not just an overlap in the readers of fantasy and science fiction, there's an overlap in writers. If I'm looking for books by C.J. Cherry or Greg Bear or Tad Williams, Tanith Lee, and a million names I'm blanking on at the moment, why should I have to check out more than one section at the library or bookstore? Let me guess, alternate history should be in its own section, even if it's just a shelf. Here's the thing. You're right. And I still feel the way that I feel. This is truly just my preference. I probably shouldn't have put that one because it seems to make people a little upset. And then somebody replied to that. I agree with this, and would also like to add that the delineation between fantasy and sci-fi isn't as clear cut as people think. Technology. I'd argue that Star Wars is the biggest example where it is okay. Yes, Star Wars is space wizards. I don't actually think it's sci-fi, but in my head it is sci-fi. I don't know. I'm just lost in this world, okay? Somebody else said, what I wished would happen, it won't, is that they would get rid of the sci-fi fantasy label. Just get rid of it altogether, which sounds like two things are being pushed together. Instead, the section should be just called speculative fiction, and everything that falls under that umbrella can be included. Ooh, and then somebody said, should I, Robot have been shelved with biology textbooks just because Asimov wrote both? That's a good point. I like that user a lot. I feel defended. Somebody else said, funny thing is, I actually feel nostalgic for a time when sci-fi and fantasy were more mixed together. I often wish I could find more of those stories without having to go back to the older pulps. Give me more stories of parking your spaceship down at the Wizard's Tower, please. I've never read anything like that before, and I don't think I want to. But, each to their own. That's the whole point of this, is each to their own. Oh, and then there's some more irredeemable characters. Sometimes they're needed. I think I've said all that I can say on that. Somebody said, I've grown to despise fantasy schools. The houses, the sanctioned bullying, the cliches, the love interest who's in love with the bully, the one teacher that hates main character for no reason, the one teacher that likes main character because they are special, the ragtag group of friends they make, the jocks, all of it, and it seems to get shoehorned into everything. I love it. I personally like magic schools. I can totally see specific things that this person has brought up being not necessarily problematic, but frustrating or repetitive. I can understand that. I personally like the magic school formula, and I can understand why somebody else might not. Somebody brought up the magicians, which I watched the show but didn't read the books. And then somebody said, I'm actually in the market for one of these. I love this. The fact that somebody said, I hate these. And then somebody asked for recommendations for specifically the thing that the person who originally commented said they hate. It's all in one thread. That's amazing. Ooh, there's actually a lot of recommendations here that I'm going to be taking note of. Crestomancy, that sounds fun. Grumpy Wizard's Mansion. Oh, I will be looking that up immediately. Hatful of Sky, which I own somewhere over there. Terry Pratchett. It deconstructs and criticizes the magic school trope. Yes, love that. Rhythmatist by Brandon Sanderson, by Brando Sando. And then somebody said Scholomance by Naomi Novik, which is one of my favorite series. I need to finish it. It's also up there somewhere. I think it's a really fun infrastructure for a fantasy story. Just saying. Will of the Many apparently has a magic school story. Doesn't Name of the Wind also have a magic school? Somewhat. Vita Nostra. Yes. Somebody said specifically, I like watching characters discover their powers/skills, and I like tournament arcs. It just so happens that those are a common feature of school settings. Yep. The Year of the Griffin. Somebody said, sounds like you hate YA fantasy school. I mean, Scholomance is YA fantasy. I think it depends on who writes it and if it fits the actual YA genre parameters, which some stories about young adults aren't actually written within the unspoken parameters of the YA genre. Somebody said they're also never at school or in class. I think you've not read enough. I think you probably need to branch out and read some more, because like Scholomance, they literally cannot leave the school. Okay, we're gonna make a part 2 of this video because I'm only halfway through and I've been recording for an hour. So this is only going to be part 1 of reading through these hot takes. So stay tuned for the part 2, and that will be coming out a week after this one is posted. So yeah, stay tuned for that. If you feel like it, go check out this thread, read through the comments for yourself. Please go down into the comments and sound off your hot takes, respond to the hot takes that were in this video. You can respond to my hot takes too, as long as you're not mean to me. I'm super sensitive and I will cry. I'm gonna sign off for now. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, because the algorithm loves a thumbs up, and so we also love a thumbs up. So please do that. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit the bell if you want to, stick around. Take your coat off. Stay a while. Please forget that I did that. But seriously, thanks so much for watching all the way through this video. I so appreciate you. You're the real ones if you made it this far. I love you all so much. Keep the magic alive, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!